Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity and discovery. My name is Cybele Raver, and I serve as the provost of Vanderbilt University. As a leader in higher education and as a social scientist, I believe that we can transform higher education for the 21st century. I'm wildly curious about other people's work, whether it's in science, the social sciences, and the humanities, or the arts. This podcast gives us the opportunity to break open new ideas through discovery and creative expression. Why are you curious? What are you curious about? What about research, innovation, art, philosophy, politics, or music fascinates you and leaves you hungry to learn more? Major Jackson is the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently Razzle Dazzle, New and Selected Poems. His edited volumes include Best American Poetry 2019, Renga for Obama, and Library of America's County Cullen Collected Poems. He's the author of A Beat Beyond, the select prose of Major Jackson, edited by Amar Kohli. Major is a recipient of fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, the John S. Guggenheim Foundation, and National Endowment for the Arts. He frequently publishes poems and essays in a host of publications, including The New Yorker, Orion Magazine, Paris Review, Poetry London, and World Literature Today. He serves as poetry editor of the Harvard Review and host of the podcast The Slowdown. That's a podcast that I adore and I recommend really, really highly. Major Jackson is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Major, I want to first thank you. This is such a truly amazing opportunity to talk with you about your work, about your vision for the power of poetry and creativity for transformation. Major, I want to spend time reading and discussing several of your poems, and instead of talking about them, I want us just to dive right in.
Great idea.
With the first poem, especially the first poem of this new volume, because I find it so inspiring, so beautiful, but also it's the beginning of a new season. It's the beginning of this podcast series. It's the beginning of our school year as a university, but I think you're also talking about bigger restarts or beginnings. So if you could read Let Me Begin Again, I would be honored.
Great choice. Thank you. Let me begin again. Let me begin again as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell slowly examined by a brown child on a beach at dawn, straining to see their future. Let me begin this time knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Let me burn my vanities, old music in the pines, snifters of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the island of my fears only once, then live like a raging waterfall and grow a magnificent mustache. Let me not ever be the birdcage or the serrated blade, or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed. Soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds toward sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer. I am licking my lips.
So amazing. So powerful.
Thank you.
I could talk about this poem all day. It's just amazing. And I guess the first thing I would love to just say is that I think of this poem as a kind of psychic nourishment. You're providing us with this sort of fortifying intellectual or psychological or imagistic vitamin, some kind of fortifying agent.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I see poems in that idea of Lewis Hyatt's notion of the art as gift, but also, as you put it, something that is reifying for me as well. So when I set out to pull together a collection of poems over 5 volumes and add new poems, in a way I was recommitting to poetry itself. As you know, sometimes we can get thrown off track from the thing that we actually love. So it was such a gift to go back and be reminded of the possibilities of what language can do, or what a poem can do in our world. We've known poems to kind of console us. We've known poems to express the inner rage at some injustice. And so me coming back to my old poems, I really feel like I needed to go back to that space where poetry was working so many different registers for me. So in this particular case, with this poem, I really believe in music. And so you get a lot of repetition. And so I'm kind of anchoring that. I'm also high-fiving, in a way, my great concern about the environment. I also believe with that line addressed to the reader that I should have married you sooner. I think poems should also connect to a larger community and not be so inward. And also, I have this strong belief that great art comes out of curiosity. And it also comes out of not knowing the answers, kind of what you were recently talking about, now that I think about it.
I love this sort of sense of there's a humility and a recognition. I love that moment where you recognize our own failings for having had grand thoughts that may have gotten in our own way. Let me burn my vanities. I just love that line. And I love, the let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. So that sense of being open to knowing something for the first time.
I don't know, but for me, someone who lives in a way with this ever-growing sense of our interconnectedness, I think it's immensely humbling to come to a community with not this kind of hierarchical sense of knowledge or wisdom, but knowing that there's a greater wisdom that's born out of exchange.
That's great. It actually allows me to pivot to the question about curation. This title, I believe, is a Philip Levine title, and so you're giving us a quick wink or a tip of the hat to another poet that you'd like us to know more about.
Thank you for saying that. Philip Levine was a very important poet for me and several generations of American poets. And he, born in Detroit, working class poet, someone who wrote very movingly, I want to say, about working class people and people who kind of struggle, but in a way that kind of not politicized them, but wrote with a great sense of dignity. His great volume, What Work Is, which won the 1992 Pulitzer Prize, was a collection that I literally carried in my backpack for a year. And if I pulled it out, you got a sense of who kind of like, it's almost like you're part of the club. If you're like,
you flash the cover,
coffee
shop.
Like coffee, exactly. Right. For sure. And his particular, the impulse to title and wink, as you say, really signals something that's been very important to me, is that we have this great tradition of poetry in America. And I'm not sure if we have a regard for past literature like we used to. And maybe it's because there's such a great swath of poets who are of all backgrounds who are writing. But I really believe that we need to celebrate and cherish an art form that gives expression to a wide range of experiences in our country, and that Whitmanian sense of our greatness is owed to our plurality. I so believe in that. And so me winking to Philip Levine, Sonia Sanchez, Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde, it's really me saying, hey, there's an intertextuality here, and I'm not here without them.
Right. So then, of course, I went and read that poem.
Oh, fantastic!
And then I knew you wanted me to, because that's the signal that was sent that you sent in the title, right? And that I then noticed that the end lines of that poem refer to a child, himself as a child, and then I immediately reflect on the first lines of this poem. But I also love that in that poem, he winks at Icarus, it seems, right?
That's right.
At a child flying too close to the sun.
That's right.
And this idea of taking risks and how we have to occasionally face the fact that we failed and that we have to begin again, right? So suddenly I'm in this like wild, whirling set of conversations and references, and I'm so grateful to you for inviting me in, right? As a person who doesn't know that much from an academic standpoint about poetry, that you've brought me in that way. And I think a lot about your role at the Harvard Review and in the podcast. I think I've heard you referred to as curating poems. And I often think about curation. One of the responses that we might have to that word is this idea of someone who selects the highest quality, right? Is sort of a judge, that your judgment matters. But what I hear you doing when I hear you curating is actually sharing, that you're introducing us and bringing us in. And that when you do that in the podcast, you're doing it every day, right? You're on what, 1,188th episode?
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah. My enthusiasm for poetry almost implicitly requires that I serve as an ambassador without that hierarchical sense of taste. I mean, and as you can imagine with the Harvard Review, there's already embedded this sense that I'm going for the highest incarnations of the art. But really, for me, there's several aims and goals for me. One, I do like poems that speak back to a tradition, but I also like poems that are historically based, or I like poems that speak to our kind of quotidian existence, our everydayness. And you know, I'm really starting to kind of cherish. I mean, it's occasionally when I'm up against a deadline for slowdown episode scripts, I complain a little bit, but I'm really excited to know that quite possibly someone can hear something. They may not understand the full poem from title down to the last line, but they'll hear a line and it might just turn the corner for them that day.
Absolutely.
Something that they needed to hear.
Absolutely.
Something that kind of sparks a thought or thinking, or invites them to kind of do the work of deep diving into an area that they hadn't thought about, but they were curious.
I mean, I totally resonate with that. So this as both a prayer in a way, let me, had that resonant feeling of prayer, but also conversation. That you address the reader, that you're engaging me in a conversation.
I do consider poetry a sacred, secular conversation.
That's great. So to help, I think, those of us who may not be fully trained in how to read a poem, I'd love you to pull back, sort of, I'm flashing on Wizard of Oz and pulling back that green velvet curtain, right? To show us the mechanics of how a poem works.
Sure.
So, I love, the line that absolutely makes my heart clench is the let me run at breakneck speeds towards sceneries of doubt, right? That's this incredibly intense, speedy, not speedy, but, the poem obviously says it better than I can. But you get us there, I think, by building so much from a slower pace earlier with that quiet child that we don't want to disturb or interrupt, right? And then you circle us around that island. Right? So can you give us a sense of how you structured this poem?
Sure. This poem began when I was thinking about my children. I would take them to Long Beach Island and Atlantic City. And there's that moment where, and you don't have to be a parent, but you can be on that beach and you can see a kid who's so engrossed in what they're holding. It could be a shell, it could be the carcass of a mollusk. And that moment of interiority feels so precious to me. It feels so important. And so when I think the poem, as you know, begins with that Philip Levine, but it's like, okay, what do I want to be? I want to be a quiet thought that a child, we're not used to thinking in a sense, unless, you have a kid who's maybe quietly reading, you look over, but to be that quiet thought and knowing that they are rooted in a space of innocence and curiosity, and knowing that curiosity is going to kind of push them forward in life and if they can retain that, which we often talk about. So I also like the sound of just the short E's, let me begin again. You can kind of hear the slide of vowels there. So, and then I'm using the simile there. We know that because it as, let me begin as a quiet thought. And so sometimes I think it was the poet Derek Walcott who said, once a poet writes those first early lines, they know the sound of a poem. And that's what I'm looking for when I tap the pen to the page. What is going to be the music that emerges? And so in this particular case...
Wow, I flash on you like as a ceramicist, right? Like, you're feeling the shape of the pot.
Yeah, truly. Yeah, that's a great image to bring to it. Or the stroke of a brush, the writer or the artist is trying to see what shape is going to emerge in the same way that a ceramicist is trying to figure out that shape. So I hear the sound there. I know I'm going to use anaphora, which is a repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of a sentence rather than at the end of the sentence. So I'm moving through, and now I just want images. And I'm typically an image-driven poet rather than, let's say, someone who's unfolding a poem rhetorically, although I do believe images start to create their own, as you said it, accretion towards a space of enlightenment. And so the images are drumming, morning rivers. I love when morning light hits a river or a sea. I'm pushing forward. And for me, I do feel as though if there's anything that stops us is our fears to speak in a room or to raise our hand or our fears of the other. And if we start to think of our fears as not a country, but something smaller, and so that A of B metaphor, island of my fears, really emerged out of nowhere. And sometimes, let me just say, the act of writing is such a conversation with one's subconscious, like you're not sure where those images are coming from.
Well, and that's so psychological. I'll just interject, right? Because it's that idea that's so, I think, true, which is we're allowed to be in our fear, but only briefly.
That's right.
Like,
that's
you get
truly
to circle the island once.
That's right.
I love that you set that limit. Right. Like, you can't endlessly get caught in perseveration. You get one time.
Anxiety. Otherwise, that's anxiety, right? Yeah. Like you're living in that space of fear and anxiety, and you're debilitated. And the raging waterfall, this summer I was in another country, and I just stumbled upon a waterfall and such the power of it and the majesty of it. And I think if we can live with that sense of at least with children, right? We really want them to step into that power. And I need to buy humor. I'm typically not funny, but I laughed out loud when I wrote a magnificent mustache. There's something like
of course,
so
I immediately
forward,
looked up at you.
Right? There's something so forward about like someone who's, a very thick, magnificent, or right, a very kind of like
handlebar.
Handlebar, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I think there's so I'm moving through these images, and then the pause, the turn to the environment and to the reader and to going to that line that you mentioned, sceneries of doubt. I think I'm sure it was the poet John Keats, the English poet, who wrote to, it might have been his brother. No, it was a friend. He wrote to a friend, and he was talking about how we hesitate towards poetry, how poetry is this thing of where people keep at an arm's length. And he wants to encourage people to not, to feel like they need to know the poem and its meaning. And I love this phrase, to live in uncertainty and doubt, which is a very Buddhist notion, right? But in this particular case, I'm calling that up because I want to inhabit that space of doubt and uncertainty as a way of looking for the answers, and also just kind of living a little bit more spiritually rather than irritable reaching and grasping for answers.
Oh, it totally reads that way. It reads like seize life,
Yeah.
seize Seize uncertainty.
Yeah. So that was the, as you know, the poem turns an address to the reader, and then it comes back to the reader and say, look, I'm licking my lips, which is a gesture of hunger, which is a gesture of I'm back at it. I'm writing, and my curiosity and my, it's going. All engines are firing. I'm ready to go.
It's such an incredibly moving, great way to start both the volume and my day and our year. It's just, thank you so much for this poem.
Thank you.
And you've spoken a lot about how rich and intense and captivating your imagery is. I found it often actually kind of psychedelic, to be honest. I'm so blown away by the feeling of synesthesia that you taste color and you put words together that meld for an incredibly intense sensory experience. I thought maybe if you'd read Climate on page 30,
sure.
Just as an example, but also just to discuss it a little, it'd be great.
Climate. What the heart knows. A ramekin of warm peach cobbler crowned with a splodge of vanilla, whose slow melting is the altering of the seasons. The coming of autumn swirling in a mass of milky orange sugar. Bach's Sonata No. 1 in B minor, its opening movement, a sojourn reminiscent of December rain or my grandfather, graveside, alone, his frightened stare into a dirt hole recalling his errors. The heart knows the spine as the exquisite corridor to the senses, noodle-like strands registering the tingling of beach pebbles underfoot. A courageous plunge into an iron-cold sea, or the way you feel when she pulls her favorite lichen green dress over her head, rivering her body, a fabric waterfall across the heart, which also knows Orpheus's frantic reach, Bernini's sculpture, Pluto's ghost-white fingers clutching Proserpina's thigh in the Borghese, or Serena's shattering swing, her victorious scream. Yet the heart does not know primordial dangers, wildfire scattering a devil's dream, hurricane winds drowning castles to make a sudden skeleton of us all, and why we devour and swallow earth like vultures on a highway and stand around waiting our turn. So I'm so happy to hear you say that word synesthesia. I do feel as though my mind sometimes works in that way, and some of it is owed to a debt to surrealist art and surrealist poets and writers in the last century. Something that I feel as though in our quest to kind of give representation to our lives, we've lost the magic of the imagination to kind of do that. I think Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison were great exemplars in fiction, and we used to have a whole host of poets. So there's something quite deliberate in thinking about peach cobbler, vanilla ice cream, and how that takes me to fall colors in a way. I say autumn swirling in a mass of milky orange sugar. Thinking about I was listening probably this morning to that sonata by Bach, and there was something tender and meditative about it, which took me to a memory of my grandfather when my grandmother died, and this deep longing look, as we all make, right? Graveside. And I'm moving closer towards, as I think about all these kind of visceral images, I wish there was a greater consciousness about our collective consumption of natural spaces. And the haunting image that came to me chomp, chomp, eat, eat, bite, bite, consume, consume, was of vultures on a highway. There's something startling when you see that particular image. And I ended the poem there. I have to admit, I tend to end on questions or end on an image that invites less of a kind of declaration. And I think the declaration is really heavy here. So I wrote it and I'm happy with it because I love the movement of the images. But I also I have to admit, I might, if there's another selected down the line, I might revise that ending. But this poem was written when we first moved to Nashville, and it was published in the Oxford American, who had, in a way, commissioned some
journal.
poems. Yeah, it's a great journal. Yeah.
I mean, I just love that combination of the sweet and then the fragmented memories, but also the morbid, right? The vultures of, sort of our own destruction of the earth. You do this amazing thing of combining, really, I think I wrote, Major Jackson as neuroscientist and Jedi Knight. Like, you do this thing where you're tapping into like a deep force from my perspective, but you're doing it in a way that triggers a ton of sensory experience, but also real deep thought, sort of what do we owe to the canon in terms of art, or what do we owe to ourselves and to each other in terms of our responsibility to maintain love in the face of all of the loss. I mean, there's just like a million ideas. I just thought, wow, this is synaptic firing on all fronts. How is it that your imagery, that idea of, we're just talking about how to get us to a favorite lichen green dress over her head, rivering her body, and then you take us to Orpheus's frantic reach. Can you tell us a little bit about whether that comes to you in a flash or whether you are actually spending hours, putting together those colors, those references?
Wow, I've wrestled with this, my own process, for a number of years, mainly because I want to master it and hopefully tap gold somewhere, With this particular poem, it did come in one fell, but then I had to come back and edit. And the edit was thinking about, to some extent, I claim my inheritance. I claim my rootedness in popular culture. I had an aunt who worked in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and on hot days, she let me and my cousins roam around inside that big, beautiful building for free. And so I'm not shy about dropping references, but I also want to hopefully invite the reader to not be intimidated by the references. So whether they're Greek or they are classical artworks, or, there's a poem in there that references Jay-Z. And I've long believed that there's no such thing as high art and common art. And because I grew up in a time and a space where one did not have to be shy about what you took in. Like, no one judged you for listening to hip hop music and later that evening going to an art exhibit. You know what I mean? So the process and the movement of this poem through this kind of imagism, but fragmented imagisms, really kind of build to a moment where I can turn. The heart is this, the heart is that, and that turn, but the heart doesn't know these things. And it's these things that a consciousness about the climate and our consumption that I really want a reader to kind of think about, or at least through the haunting image of vultures, which I admit makes a very strong declaration, to carry that image with them, quite possibly.
Well, and I love that you are taking us out of a really contemporary conversation about the environment, about climate, and taking us into the art museum to look at a painting about plague, or to look at a painting about loss. That you're doing that amazing thing of sharing with us, curating by pointing to and offering us these amazing different ways of seeing that question. It's so heteroglot. It's so Catholic with a little c, right? The range is just amazing, and then and therefore the welcome is so amazing. It's great.
Thank you.
It makes me think a little bit about how you define yourself. You mentioned that you had an aunt who was working in the art museum, and that you spent a lot of time in the art museum. And I think a lot about our biographies. I was a quote-unquote latchkey kid. I don't know if you remember that phrase from the 80s, but I spent a ton of time in the Metropolitan Museum of Art because you could get in for a dime. You could literally give any donation and you could spend all afternoon. It was a safe, great place to do homework. And that way in which you meld all these different experiences, but I also get the sense that you don't want to be boxed in.
That's right.
You don't want to be known only in one way.
Yeah.
I think I heard you speak in an interview about how you didn't want to be understood or have to carry only the language of political writing that was very much the atmosphere in which we were young adults in the 80s and 90s. And yet your work is really about calling us to not only transform ourselves, but to transform the world. It's very much a call, not just a attention to, right? You are actually bringing us into a call to action. I was wondering if you'd read for us a poem that speaks a lot to that, for me at least. And obviously the title highlights where you want us to go, and that's Picket Monsters.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for the generous reading of the work. And this is a prefacing to the poem. I have this utter belief that the more art we take in, the more poems, the more music, the more we enlarge as individuals, because we are consuming a vision beheld by someone who had their own set of events in life and experiences, and it's distillated into this canvas or this song or this poem. And when it enters in and melds with our own kind of biography, then hopefully there is either empathy or understanding. And so the work becomes spiritual, which is why I say poems are sacred in a way, sacred conversations. It becomes a great, great gesture of exchange, a way to mediate relationships that are not in the realm of the political, but in the realm of the space of the arts, dare I say, humanities.
Yeah, so generous.
So Picket Monsters, I can tell you where I wrote this. I was teaching at Columbia University, and I was going up the steps, and it felt to me that year I was visiting and teaching in the creative writing graduate program that there was always a protest. Like on those steps, like every week that I went there at that particular time. And it recalled to me my own youth activism, student activism at Temple University, and the great struggle at that time was the fight against apartheid in South Africa. And I was reading a lot of poets, listening to a lot of music, and Duke Ellington, John Coltrane's Alabama, which didn't make it in here, but an early draft it did. And I think ultimately there is the language of headlines. When we bring it into a poem, I think it invites a greater reflection, pause. We can live with the language rather than it flashing on the news, on our feeds. So Picket Monsters. For I was born too in the stunted winter of history. For I too desired the lion's mouth split in the world that is not ours, and the wounded children set free to their turnstiles of wonder. I too have blinked speechless at the valleys of corpses, wished Scriabin's black mass in the executioner's ear, Ellington in the interrogation room. I now seek gardens where bodies have their will, where the self is a compass point given to the lost. Let me call your name. The ground here is soft and broken. This poem, I haven't read it in a long time, so thank you for earmarking this one. I've always carried, you just heard me talk about poems, but I was thinking about my aunt and the gift she gave me of art. There's something humanizing, I truly believe, whether or not, someone's interrogating someone. And I think around this time, when I wrote this poem, which would probably have been the second or third book, we were going through the war with Iraq, and there were so many images of torture that was coming up. And I'm not sure if listening to Ellington would humanize someone who's so far removed to their own humanity that they can commit acts of violence. But I have this strong belief that somehow if we collectively held these voices, collectively forward art as a great power, then quite possibly we won't have as much violence in the world.
I totally heard that in this poem, Major. The idea that the wailing, so I had to, of course, look up Black Mass because I didn't know this reference. And this idea of that this wailing music would be in the ear of, a person carrying out the state's will, right? That idea that the state has called upon that person to do a terrible act, and that it's art that's going to get in that person's mind and change or somehow shape what might happen next. And it's so powerful to me because you're not asking us to be saccharine or universalist or look away from the things that are deeply upsetting, right? You're not asking us to look away from the valleys of corpses. But you are ending on this idea that the ground here is soft and broken, which makes me think of both a gravesite and a fertile new field.
That's right. Agricultural. Absolutely. Right. That's right. I'm so happy you picked up on that kind of nuance reference to the ground and the ambiguity of that image. The turn towards gardens and bodies, which is we have to turn the earth. We have to kind of turn through these cycles that are currently going through, and hopefully arise with a belief, a greater sense of freedom and regard for each other. But we have that history behind us.
Yes.
And so you're absolutely, that image embodies both that gesture towards the path, but hopefully a renewal where I hope the poem is.
Just so effective. It leaves me feeling motivated and energized rather than only trapped in grief, right? Only trapped in something that feels disempowering or alienating.
That's a great phrase. Yeah, I think poems act that way quite powerfully, actually, because I do think the ambiguity sometimes of poems can also be the thing that that prevents a reader from cozying up to its possibility, going back to that living in uncertainty and doubt. But it can also be a great transformative space if one allows oneself to kind of say, hey, this image could go either way, and I'm comfortable with that.
Love that. I never thought about that ambiguity is actually key to transformation.
Oh,
right?
I so believe that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Great poetry gift to science. Love it. It makes me think a lot about you and how you define yourself and the way in which you take that on with this great sense of humor and great sense of metaphysical set of questions in your own poetry. I thought about the poems Double Major, the poem Major and I, and of course the hilariously funny but also resonated the it must be the supermarket in me sense of being ready to be all things to all people all the time.
Yeah.
Would you read the one of those? I was thinking maybe Double Major, since it's the last poem in the collection.
Double Major. The impulse to write the poem was kind of triggered by the fact that I wrote a poem called Major and I, which is a assignment from the great Argentinian writer Borges, and because it opened, I thought I would finish the.
Well, wait, say more about the assignment.
Oh, so the assignment, great. Here we go. So Jorge Luis Borges wrote a poem called Borges and I, in which he has his inner self talk publicly about his, what everyone knows, the famous writer Borges.
Great.
So he gives space, right? And it's an interesting, great conceit for a poem because, as Whitman says, we contain multitudes, right? There's different sides of us. And the idea of giving voice to one of those speakers is a great imaginative leap. And it's also, in a way, kind of payback in a way, right? So, the famous Borges, the one that you see is the one that gets to gets celebrated. But the Borges, the inner Borges that does the work of writing and imagining and thinking. So I think there was an editor who gave an assignment to a number of writers to take that conceit up. Margaret Atwood wrote something, a number of writers, and he collected them. And unfortunately, I was too young to have gotten that call and include it. So some of us have continued to. Frank Bedart has a great poem called Frank Bedart and I.
What a great, I didn't realize that there was this club assignment, right?
It's very interesting. I have this strong belief that when you take on a job, particularly a poet, there are a set of unnamed, unwritten job requirements. You have to write a sonnet. You have to write an ode. You have to write a love poem. You have to write an elegy. And this is emerging as one of those particular assignments.
That's awesome. You have to kind of show both sides, right? You have to expose the inner as well as celebrate the outer, or mock it, whichever way you're going to go, right?
Exactly. So there's a tone of humor in here, I think, or at least the idea is kind of humorous from the start. But I begin this book, The Absurd Man, with Major and I decide to close it with that same speaker with Double Major, which of course is a pun on our area of academia. So Double Major. I emerge whenever he confuses the lamp for a moon. It is then he thinks of fine bindings and ordered athenaeums. I own his face, but he washes and spends too little time behind his ears. He sees me in the mirror, behind thick clouds of shaving cream, then suddenly believes in ghosts. His other selves are murals in the cave of his mind. They are speechless, yet large. They stare his wishes like summer rain and amplify his terrors like newscasters. What he doesn't know, his dreams are his father's dreams, which are his grandfather's dreams, and so on. They possessed a single wish. He knocks repeatedly on the bolted door to his imagination. Tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with his poetry, and thus I am his most loyal critic. He trots me out like a police dog. He calls our thirst for pads and pencils destiny. Our voices come together like two wings of a butterfly. On occasion, he closes his eyes and sees me. I am negative capability, the test to all men are created equal. We are likely to dance at weddings against my will. He pulled out the same moves writing this poem, a smooth shimmy and a hop. This page is a kind of looking glass, making strange whatever stone carvings he installed along the narrow road to his interior. I suffer in silence, wedded to his convictions. He would like to tell you the truth about love, but we are going to bed.
Just love it.
Such a silly poem. I have fun sometimes writing poems.
I love that you do that. I love that you include so much humor in your poetry. And sometimes you do it as a shock. You're the poems carrying us along on some intensely rich, romantic, or, major metaphor. And then suddenly you'll spin around and mock that voice in a way that it's so great. It's so, it helps those of us, I think, who are new feel so included.
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, poetry can be pretentious sometimes, and I need to undercut that like as often as possible. And all I need to do is just like imagine my grandfather. There is a poem in which I poke fun at, from his perspective, for him to kind of see me in this space. He who was a construction worker, who was born in 1917, he was of a different generation, but he was also very supportive. I want to say that the poem has him poking fun at me and my kind of loftiness, but ultimately, because we shared the same name, he was very proud. He was Major Gooch, who was actually born here in Nashville. But yeah, so I try to. And as I've gotten older, I think the arc of my consciousness, considering the social and economic spaces I come from, the journey has been one in which I've had to look back and wonder, and also look back and wonder and laugh, and also realize this is also fleeting, and it's also a gift. It's a blessing. So it's imperative for me to get all of that as much as I can in the poems.
It's so helpful to hear you speak about that, about bringing it in as a reflection on where you've come from, or where you've lived, or what your family members might say about you. And I think a lot about what you mentioned earlier in terms of our quote unquote, the business we're in university with double major as a pun, because I also thought about you teaching here, right? That in a way, you're making space for students to think about how they, are experiencing themselves anew and in a different light, and that's okay. They're not disloyal to their communities of origin or families if they are finding themselves in this elite institution of higher ed. They're not leaving behind oneself they discover a new self. At least that's what I sort of soaked from this page, right?
Yeah. The freedoms that I'm talking about in this poem has to do with agency. This is a poem in which the interior doesn't feel like they have agency, but there's a loyalness. And I was thinking about this quote actually it's from John Berger, but Adrienne Rich quotes John Berger in saying, "Defy the space that separates." And that is also part of what I feel as though when we have students come to an elite institution like Vanderbilt, the hope is that they realize that they don't have to leave behind. They're not being disloyal, but moving forward, there is that imperative to kind of make connections, and hopefully make connections that is going to empower someone else. So the poem, in a way, speaks to the interiority and their aims to kind of serve as a bridge. But and right dead in the center of the poem is his father's dreams and his grandfather's dreams. You hear me alluding to all men are created, just this long struggle for African Americans to live in a space in which whatever oppressive forces are at work, it's freedom. And there's something about, I feel like education, I feel like writing, I feel like art, all of it leads towards this ability to kind of articulate a selfhood that is unfettered, an imagination that is unfettered.
That's such a beautiful word, unfettered, right? That you are free to, I am free to, any student here is free to explore and embrace and pursue in ways that are unfettered. What a great word.
And claim themselves in a way that they might not have been able to which is also part of their journey and their growth. Yeah, it's a very special moment for them.
And in that classroom moment, Major, when you have, I imagine 2 to 3 students who are already fully versed. They know themselves as poets. They know their powers, right? I think of the MFK Fisher, the measure of my powers, right? They know the measure of their powers. But then there are probably 2 or 3 students who have no idea why they've landed in your class, but something drew them, something brought them into that class, something sparked that desire, and they're there, but you can see they're maybe 1 foot out.
Absolutely.
How do you navigate that space as a professor?
You may or may not know my undergraduate degree was in accounting business school at Temple University. And yet the case studies from those classes did not tell the full story. So I found myself taking a lot of English classes. And yet, even though I came from a great high school, college prep, I was one of those students that wasn't sure why I was drawn, but I wound up doing a number of classes in drama, women's literature, and I stumbled into a class with Sonia Sanchez, and she gave the gift of seeing everyone and realizing that we can all be each other's best advocate and bridges towards learning, that we are equally invested in our peers' growth as our own growth. So my way of navigating that is to quickly create the seminar environment where we're asking questions and all of us are guided by this collective search, this not individual, but this collective search for answers.
We get there together.
Yeah.
Amazing. And is it always everyone joining in on a shared goal, or is it occasionally that people are really interested in fundamentally different objectives?
That is it's both. I think so for example, we are looking at in the next week, I'm just thinking about my syllabus because I just
it'd be great.
Finished it. Yeah.
What's the course title?
The course title is a graduate poetry workshop, but as I told them, even though it's a kind of a art-based, studio-based class, we're addressing immense critical questions about language and the power of language and what it can do. And so we're at that level, but then we're going to explore poetic forms and also dive into some of the questions that have animated past poets. So some of my students, when we talked the other day, several of them are indigenous, some of them are second-generation Americans. And so they're coming at this question of language vis-a-vis their own identity and maybe ideologies, but we're centralizing the theme of the course. I would say at the spine of it is how does language, particularly poetic language, interacts with the larger uses of language in various settings and various communities. So they do have their individual, but we're guided by that particular.
It's going to be incredible, right? That
I'm
level
looking forward to
of
it.
engagement and that level of both certainty and viewpoint and difference in viewpoint, but also commonality because they've all got you, right? They're all here and each other.
Yeah.
Really
it's
exciting.
I'm happy to go back where we started, to begin anew this particular academic year.
No, I mean, it does, in fact, right? Because it's also, I would imagine you're calling them to see the questions they're asking in a new way. You're calling them to use language perhaps differently than they've had to use language before. That is the function of learning, right? That novice state that you gave us the space to inhabit. So,
and reframing questions, you and I both know, is part of the skill set that we have to constantly learn and come back to.
I think reframing in that moment for us and for your class does exactly what you were saying, right? It gives us space to come up with a new solution.
Yeah.
It's just really exciting in that regard.
Yeah, you and I talked before, but I strongly believe that humanities-based classes are equally laboratories. And in this case, our laboratories, the material is language. And even though they are, they're creative writers, I really want to retitle our department really creative thinking, because the imagination is such a crucial part of the thinking process whenever they're sitting down to write their poems.
Absolutely. I love that you know how strongly I value discovery, how strongly I value inquiry. And I think we often think of that as an endeavor that's really constrained by scientific methods. But I love your use of literary method, of using language and using creativity as the driving force for that kind of reimagining, that kind of rediscovery, that kind of seeing anew.
Yeah. I think what the podcast, the slowdown, is also helping me to realize. I mean, I think about it as part of the gift economy that creative poems bring to the world. But I'm also thinking about what the show is giving, which is thinking about poems as a mode of inquiry, because we don't stick to a theme. There's various topics that we approach. Often I hear when I go out, I hadn't thought about that before. And it's that I hadn't thought about before more than I love the poem that I'm really aiming for.
Such a great note to end on, Major. That's exactly the right note to end on. I hadn't thought about it before, and I can't wait to learn more.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a joyful moment for me.
Great conversation. Thank you so much, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in. We'll be back next time with another guest who's pushing the boundaries of discovery. Until then, I'm Cybele Raver, and this is Quantum Potential.